Cyberpunk is here. We have it, and on every platform out there. In terms of open world games, it's an absolute colossus in its technical ambition, giving top-end PCs a way to showcase visuals way beyond what's usually possible. Ray tracing, volumetric lighting, it all combines to create something incredible on PC. But on console, well, here it is. And perhaps inevitably, it's a different story, missing many of those top-end presets. Cutbacks are a reality, but how severe are they? And is it still at the very least playable? To answer that, we turn to the last-gen PlayStation consoles first, looking at the most widely adopted machine, PS4, and the enhanced PS4 Pro version today. Can they handle Cyberpunk even with CDPR's optimizations? Does frame rate hold up? And what of the resolutions? I dug into the early hours of the game to get a first look at what's going on, and to help me discuss the findings here, I have my good friend and colleague, John Linneman.
Hey Tom, I've also been playing the game, mostly on PC of course, but I did sample some of the console versions as well. And yes, just to get the information out there, we're starting with PS4 first it seems, but I know you're going to be doing Xbox next, so we'll have both of them.
Yeah, we'll get there.
I haven't actually played it myself on the base system yet, but looking at what you've captured and the data you've shared, it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like the big question I think going into this is, people want to see the next-gen consoles running it, and I'm sure we'll get to that eventually, but the base consoles are the most widely used, and so it felt like the fairest thing to jump in here and just give it an honest breakdown of what you're really getting, at least, based on the first 3 hours as a sample. But yeah, it is, to be honest, not looking altogether too good for the base machine.
It's a little dire, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in fact, I guess the thing I would say before we get started here is that what this brings to mind actually is a lot of the late generation games released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, where games started to sort of exceed what those machines were capable of, and the performance and visual loss was extremely obvious. Stuff like Far Cry 3, Crysis 3, lots of 3s actually. These games did not work well on PS3 or 360. You had to play it on PC. And that's kind of the sense I'm getting here.
Right, well, shall we jump straight into it and look at the breakdown of resolutions, just to know straight up what we're getting?
Let's do it.
So, worth saying that this is on patch 1.02. I know CDPR is very keen on usually updating their games. We saw it a lot with Witcher. And basically on PS4 right now, it's a dynamic 900p, which works at its peak when you look straight at the sky, but when you're in kind of the inner city areas, it's going to go down to 720p and numbers in between, so it can definitely fluctuate. But based on the frame rate, I think for the most part it's going to be hanging around the bottom end of that range there.
Yeah, so it seems like it's mostly 720p looking at your footage. And also, I noticed that the TAA doesn't really work that well with this low resolution, so there is a lot of fizzling and artifacts that result from this. So the game ends up looking extremely blurry and just kind of visually kind of glitchy as a result of this.
Yeah, that TAA that CDPR uses, it kind of adds all this banding when you kind of turn against the straight edge of a wall or stuff like that.
You know what, Tom? This is like, this is basically what you would expect a Switch port of another modern game to look like.
Yeah, definitely. You remember the Witcher 3 on Switch had all of this going on for it, all this pixel fizzle, you could call it, and all these trails, and this general look of a Vaseline effect as it adapted the resolutions.
Okay, but what about the PS4 Pro then?
So PS4 Pro, I thought, okay, what can we expect? The next level up might be 1080p, but in reality, it maxes out at 1188p, 2112 by 1188, which, if you look at the way it scales on a 4K screen, that is 55% of the overall pixel count on each axis. So it makes sense from that perspective. It's a very sort of arbitrary number, 1188, but in reality it does dip and it goes down to 972p, so 1728 by 972, which comes in at 45% on the axis of 4K. So I think overall it works really well on a 1080p screen. At the best case you get kind of a slightly super sampled image, but you're not going to really notice the drops under that too severely. It's just going to look a little smudge, a little more blurred.
And it's also worth pointing out, having seen this on PS4 Pro, it seems like the HUD and the UI elements are all rendered at 1080p as well. So there's really no 4K output happening here.
I mean, I thought that perhaps, it could push to 1440p, but it's around 1080p most of the way.
Keep her steady.
In terms of comparisons between the two, I think it's mostly straightforward. Differences in shadow quality, screen space reflections are pretty much null. There's nothing between them. And even draw distances, I did a kind of, driving test along big roads, big city areas, and there's not enough to kind of discern between the two.
And honestly, Tom, in comparison to the PC version, this is hugely cut down.
Yes.
There's just so much less detail in the scene.
You mentioned that there's a big difference in NPC count as well, cars and NPCs.
That's right, and on the PC there's a specific option for this as well. And also there's something on PC called slow hard drive mode, which I suspect is what we're seeing on the consoles as well, just to keep up with it. Because if you're on these the base or the Pro, basically last gen machines, you're going to be using most likely a mechanical hard drive. And even if you have an SSD installed, the internal controller can't take full advantage of it. So they obviously had to be cautious with this.
Yeah, it does make sense, but looking at the way it runs in these comparisons, there's still issues with streaming from those hard drives, because the base PS4 in particular, this might be incidental, it might be a bit randomized between the consoles, but I noticed on base PS4 there's a lot of kind of textures that didn't load in. Even for a long time you can just stare at a texture and it's just not popping into a higher res version of the asset. So it does seem like there's some streaming issues for sure. Some of this might be resolved by patches down the line, but for now, there are instances where you can just walk past an object and think, gosh, is that really meant to be like that? Is it? I mean, I'm waiting for it to just pop in like this rubbish bags here, which just, you look at them, you think, well...
They look like rubbish bags.
They do.
But maybe not in the way that they were intended to.
Yeah, it was really curious. But we've seen all this before with Witcher 3, which was not entirely perfect when it launched. Do you remember a lot of pop-in and a lot of visual issues? And
yeah, I wouldn't even say it wasn't just not perfect. It was actually rather poor at launch. There was a lot of performance and weird issues when the game was released on PS4, and they have gone back and mostly corrected just about everything and continued to refine and improve it. But I suspect we will continue to see some improvements, but because these are now last generation machines, I wouldn't expect them to pour as much effort into it. I think that's going to be reserved for the next gen machines. They've clearly built a high-end PC experience targeting cutting-edge hardware, and that comes with a cost.
Yeah, too true. And no better way to summarize that than to look at the performance side, because we went through this a bit earlier, but yeah, this isn't looking too great.
So I think at this point I would say I'd have been perfectly fine with the visual cuts if it guaranteed a smooth frame rate. But unfortunately, we are once again dipping back into sort of PS3 and 360 era frame rates.
At least it's V-synced on PS4. That's a plus. Right, so I think base PS4 is where I started, so let's kick off with that and give a kind of lowdown of what to expect from the first 3 hours anyway. So the first battle, it looks pretty serviceable. I mean, 30 FPS with some occasional drops to maybe 27 FPS or so. But at that point, you think, okay, this is acceptable. It's about 45 minutes into the game where you realize, okay, things have taken a very sour turn, and this is just not playable anymore. It's this sort of set piece moment where you're driving down through the inner city, and you're in a shootout and car chase. And it cannot run. It's not just that it's running at 20 FPS, under 20 FPS, but it stutters as well as it streams in the world.
There's slowdown, there's stuttering, the visual quality is seriously compromised. I mean, the whole thing is just kind of a mess.
Yeah.
And this is really just a simple scripted sequence, and the game actually gets more demanding than this as you play.
So obviously the next test is, that first moment where you emerge to the big city, where you've got full control. You can walk anywhere, you can run anywhere, you can get in your car for the first time. So getting in the car, it just immediately buckles, and you can just see this is just not going to go anywhere. As long as you're in a vehicle, you're going to have a hard time. This is interesting. I think we're in this inner city area, and on every playthrough where I turn this particular corner, there's a big stutter.
I love that it says Tom's Diner, by the way. It's somehow fitting.
I do my best. We serve our finest meals there and our lowest frame rates. But so I kind of made a bit of a benchmark out of this turn where I then turn into that sort of market area where you first get your augmentations. Because of the low frame rate, I accidentally ran over a bunch of NPCs. Really didn't mean to, but it triggered a huge battle. And I thought, all right, let's just play this out. And my God, it really, really struggles.
16 FPS, 15. This is where it actually starts to look like the original release version of The Outer Worlds on Switch, which, by the way, has been improved significantly. But the initial release of that was similarly just poor.
Yeah.
This is not the way to play the game. If this is your experience, I'd wait.
It might be just that we're pushing it too hard, but this is going to be a reality for some missions. Like, you're going to encounter combat in the open world, and it feels like even basic driving through the inner city is just buckling it. Playing later into the game, there are missions where you have shootouts indoors, and this is kind of the next big stress test. It runs mostly okay on PS4, and at least to start.
Yeah, it actually looks okay here.
And then you kind of get into it, and it really, really starts to buckle into the 20s, and it becomes just increasingly harder to play. I mean, I think this is about the level I expected of base PS4 when I went in. I thought, okay, this is kind of moderately playable. I think everyone playing this right now on a regular PS4 will kind of accept that the PS5 is out, and there's an acceptance that they won't be getting the premiere experience anymore. This is kind of a bit sidelined by comparison. But the question is this really acceptable even now, just as a standby?
That's a tricky one, and for us, obviously, we're really into this stuff and sensitive to performance dips. But you look back over the years, and people were really into stuff like Fallout 4. They were into Skyrim. Even like Grand Theft Auto 5 on PS3 and 360. You look at some of those frame rates in the city, and you're getting into the low 20s regularly, right? And people were okay with it, right? It's not good now. We've gotten used to better on these consoles, but I do think there is a subset of people playing it that they don't care. They'll be happy enough with the experience, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine.
There's definitely points where it will impact how well you can aim and how well you can drive. I did struggle to drive around even. Another thing to touch on here is the crashes I've experienced on base PS4. It's a bit of a weird one. I had this happen 3 times over the course of my playthrough, all on base PS4, not on Pro, but it's certainly possible. Basically, I went forward after entering the main city area, and the first time I talked to Jackie, pretty much it just crashes to the PS4 menus. I rebooted the whole game and tried again, and it happened right there again. So it took a full PS4 restart to get through this area, and then it ran pretty flawlessly until a battle later on against the Maelstrom clan, and it just sort of tanked the performance and then crashed again in one of the battles there. Again, this is patch 1.02, and there are more optimizations to come, so we'll have to see if this is addressed down the line.
I mean, for me, this is not acceptable. I would never want to play the game this way. It's terrible. Okay, so I kind of feel like we're just like pressing on the wound here at this point. It's not good on the base PS4. So I guess I'm interested then to see where the PS4 Pro really comes out. I've seen a little bit of this, and it's not perfect from what I've seen, but playing it myself, but it does seem to hit 30 a lot more often.
For sure. I really thought going into this chat with you, I'd be able to say, yeah, base PS4, don't go for it, but Pro's the one. Like, I started this playthrough with practically capped 30, and it was perfect.
Even that initial drive when you get out of this fight sequence, it's not bad. Like, there are dips, but it holds much closer to that 30 FPS line. So you're probably, again, it seems like, okay, this is not bad at this point.
Yeah, at that point you just think, okay, this can handle anything. But then you get out into the big city, and you begin to see, mostly it's fine, but then you first get into your car, and then immediately you realize, this is very familiar again.
It's very Grand Theft Auto, though. I mean, this is how, until this gen, Rockstar's obviously changed on PS4 and Xbox One, but this is how Rockstar games were in the past. You get in the car and it's slow. It's kind of the same thing here.
I did the same thing, by the way. Just triggered a huge battle just for the sake of it.
This alley.
This alley
is intense.
For comparison, base PS4 in this alley dropped to about 15 FPS lowest, the furthest I could push it, and this is about 18 and the worst case. So I mean, it's not an exact life test, but it is
similarly demanding.
Yeah, it's very demanding.
Kind of reminds me of the Corvega factory that you always tested in Fallout 4.
I think obviously Cyberpunk's way beyond what Fallout's doing. Quality of materials and the way lighting works, but it's a similar feeling that there's a real CPU bottleneck in terms of pulling everything together.
Yeah, I think that's actually the biggest thing here, is that the game's just too heavy on the CPUs for these Jaguar cores in all of the last gen machines. I think we're probably going to find similar results on the Xbox as well. I can't wait to see the base Xbox One, actually.
Oh my gosh.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I suspect that we're going under 720p there. But we'll see. Maybe not.
But yeah, Pro, I would say otherwise, it can hit 30 way more consistently than the base model. It's just outdoors, driving, anything to do with that sort of market area. It just isn't as playable as you'd hope.
Yeah. I mean, overall, though, if you're playing on the PS4 Pro, it does at least seem like an experience that is a lot more playable than the base system. It's very much in line with older open-world games, where we often saw pretty unstable performance. It's really, again, if you really look at this generation, I actually think the PS4 and the Pro, and they did pretty well with open-world games. Most open-world games actually deliver fairly stable frame rates. This is more in line with how it used to be, I guess you could say, and it's not good though, but them's the breaks. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much it then. It's this is definitely going to be one of those cases, I think, where you want to upgrade. There's more of this coming up, but playing this on PS5, it's still pretty soft, and it has some of the limitations because it's in backwards compatibility mode, but the frame rate is dramatically better.
It's 60 FPS uncapped as well, unlike Pro.
Correct.
Which is big. I mean, I can't wait for us to dig our teeth into that one. It's going to be really awesome. Anyway, that'll do it for this one. Thanks so much, John, for joining me on this.
Sure thing, Tom.
Right, let's do our wrap-up. If you did enjoy this, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. Also, we must stress, if you do want to see this video at high quality, we have a Patreon set up with high-quality encodes of everything we've uploaded to YouTube. You can get the original sort of upload from there. But in the meantime, from John and myself, thanks so much for watching.
No, he's alive, well, and kicking.